Chapter 11 of Recollections of a Missionary in the Great West by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Certainly, in every sense, the greatest man with whom I ever came in contact was the bishop of one of the western dioceses of which I was archdeacon. We used to think that his talents were wasted in the West, and that he should have been at the head of some important university, or the bishop of some great Eastern diocese. But the people among whom he ministered were entirely assured that he was the right man in the right place, and they loved him with a devotion such as few men receive. He was a Yale man, a Berkeley man, a Heidelberg man, a special student in some of the best European schools, a deep thinker, a clear expositor, a profound theologian, and a brilliant philosopher. He was able to clothe the deepest truth in the simplest form, to speak of the most profound things in so perspicuous a way that the plainest could understand. His learning and wisdom were accompanied by more than ordinary simplicity of character and sweetness of disposition. He was a versatile man as well. Indeed, one of his professors told him, when he was a very young man, that he did too many things well ever to do anything very well. In addition to his other qualities, he was an accomplished chess player, the champion of his college in his younger days. One day he visited a certain town in which there was a woman with several children whom she was anxious to have baptized. Her husband, who happened to be a Yale man also, had refused to consent. The bishop was a guest at her house, and she had besought him to argue the point with her husband and get his permission to baptize the children. He was a lawyer, and pointedly refused to discuss theology with the bishop, adroitly evading the question every time it was raised. The gentleman was also a chess player, and an extraordinarily good one. He was not only the champion of the town, but of a very much wider circle, and he had discovered or invented a new opening not in the books. He found out that the bishop played chess, and he said he would like to try this opening upon him. The bishop knew that there were various ways to get at a man, so he consented to play a game. The opening worked beautifully, and after a rather hard struggle the bishop was defeated. They tried it again, and this time, after a longer and harder struggle, the bishop was victorious. A third game was decided more quickly in the bishop's favor, and in the fourth game, having mastered the opening, he swept the board. The lawyer was very much chagrined, and begged for another trial. "No," said the bishop, calmly, gravely pushing away the board, "you told me you were a player when you began, but you hardly afford me common amusement. You actually do not know the first principles of the game," which was an exaggeration, "and you do not know any more about theology than you know about chess," which was quite true. The lawyer was by this time fairly indignant, and quite willing to argue or fight about chess, theology, or anything else. The next morning, bright and early, the bishop met his hostess coming down the stairs. "What did you do to my husband last night?" she asked eagerly. "I did not do anything, madam. We had a few games of chess, and then a little theological argument. Why do you ask?" "Well," she said, in great glee, "he came upstairs about 2:00 this morning and waked me up and said, 'Jane, I guess you'd better have the children baptized in the morning.' We used to tell the bishop that he certainly had gambled for those children." One day we were traveling across the plains in the caboose of a freight train. A young divinity student was with us. He was one of the ambitious kind of divinity students who wreck a parish or two when they begin, and finally drift upon the ecclesiastical bargain counter. He was ready to argue about anything with anybody. A greasy, dilapidated-looking tramp came into the caboose at one of the stations at the end of a division, and presently engaged in a heated discussion with a young theologian on the disadvantages of education. He maintained the affirmative, that the less a man knew and the less education he had, the happier he was, with so much skill and adroitness, and showed such mastery of logic and literature that he routed the poor boy, horse, foot, and dragoons so effectively, in fact, that the young man rose and went out on the platform to hide his chagrin, leaving the supposed tramp chuckling over his pipe in huge enjoyment at his easy victory. The bishop had listened without saying a word, and when the student left he turned to the man and inquired sharply, "What college are you from, sir?" "Yale," answered the man without thinking. The unlucky admission completely destroyed the man's argument, for he was a living example of the fallacy of his own proposition. He was one of the engineers of the road, and afterwards a great friend of the bishop. One day in a certain town, a certain church, not of our communion, of course, resolved to revive its formulas of belief; in other words, to make a new creed for itself and its members. In order that there might not be the slightest suggestion of ecclesiastical domination, that they might avoid the slightest appearance even of sacerdotalism, the committee appointed to draw up the creed was composed of a lawyer, a farmer, and a merchant, all practical men, with the minister religiously or irreligiously excluded. The bishop was passing along the street when the lawyer stepped out of his office and called him in. Two perplexed and embarrassed men sat at a long table on which were placed Webster's Dictionary, a Cruden's Concordance, a Bible, a prayer book, and the Westminster Confession. "These," said the lawyer, introducing the bishop, "are my colleagues on a committee to draw up a creed for our church. We have gotten as far as the Holy Ghost, and to tell the truth, as we do not any of us know anything about the Holy Ghost, we thought you might give us a little information for our articles of belief." This reminds me of a certain other church organization which attempted to draw up a creed in the same way for the government of its members. When the result of the labors of the committee appointed was read, there was great dissatisfaction. Some wanted more, some wanted less, and there was imminent danger of the complete disruption of the organization, until the chairman of the committee arose with the delightful suggestion that they compromise. So a compromise creed was drawn up, and that particular enterprise saved from shipwreck. The bishop had a relative who was a professional man in an Eastern city, and a very able man indeed, but he had unfortunately become tinged with some of the prevalent ideas of the age. He belonged to a coterie of men who thought as he, and when the bishop announced his intention of visiting him, this little club of modern thinkers determined to have some fun with the old man, in a kindly, polite way, of course. So they invited him to dinner, which was to cover a discussion in which they felt certain of coming out first best. There was fun enough at the dinner, but the sport was in the hands of the bishop. He early detected their plan, met their attack on their own grounds, and routed them completely. One by one they shamefacedly stole away, and the morning rose with the little bishop triumphant and alone on the field of battle. One by one the young men came to see him during the next day, and apologized for the part they had taken, even though in spirit of harmless fun, and many of them date the change in their opinions from that hour. Everybody listened to the man. I remember once driving across the country with him while discussing the nature of the soul. That is, the bishop was discussing. I was only prompting by a question now and then. We were on the rear seat of a wagon, with the driver on the front seat. It was a very dark night. In the middle of the bishop's exposition the wagon took a wild plunge, there was a crash, and over we went into the muddy ditch. "I beg your pardon, gents," said the driver, who had retained control of the horses, as we scrambled to our feet. "I was so interested in hearin' the little man discussin' my immortal soul, which I hardly ever knowed that I had one before, that I clean forgot where we was and drove you plump into the ditch." I have engaged him in conversation in the same way on a railroad, and he would continue to talk on until he would wake up with a start to the fact that most of the passengers in the car had crowded around his seat and were listening. "I tell you," said a cowboy to me after hearing a discussion on the atonement, "that little feller knows a heap about them things, don't he?" One day he held a service in a little town where there had never before been a service of the church. There were only 2 communicants in the village, a man and his wife. Services were held in a hired hall, and there were about 400 people present. The man assisted the bishop in rendering the service, and the congregation sat in interested silence through the whole of it. The next day, when one of those who had been present was asked her opinion of the service, she replied with feminine exaggeration, "Oh, they were perfectly grand, and I think that duet between the bishop and Mr. S. was just lovely." We used to say that the bishop had turned ritualistic because it was evident from this that he had been intoning the service. We depended upon him for everything, and we never asked help of him in vain. His own salary, his private fortune, his personal credit, were always at the service of his diocese, his clergy, and his people. He had many strange requests made of him. "What do you think of this?" he said one day, smiling and looking up from a letter he had been reading. "Here's a missionary wants a set of false teeth." He got them, too. The bishop paid for them. Indeed, there was no other way. Things were so depressed that year that the bishop not only had to get bread and butter for his clergy, but he had to provide some of them with teeth to enable them to eat it. The little giant is dead now, broken down. All that I ever did in the way of work, or suffered in the way of hardships, if they could be called so, he did over and over again, and suffered much more, and he was an old man twice my age, and not naturally physically strong as I was. In addition to the mere physical labor which he shared in common with his clergy, he had upon his shoulders things which no one could relieve him of: responsibilities, anxieties, financial demands, the care of all the churches, appalling burdens. Full of years, developing in power, ability, and experience in the most extraordinary progression with every added hour of his life, with infinite possibilities of future usefulness before him, he had to break down under the pressure. Western dioceses are bishop killers at best. No, that is unjust. It is the Church herself which kills her bishops. She puts them in positions where their faculties are taxed to the utmost naturally. She gives them rank, position, a bare living, and then she loads upon their shoulders, if they be men, as they always are, who see the opportunities, accept the responsibilities, and endeavor to fulfill the obligations of their position, burdens too heavy for any mortal man to bear. She provides them with little money, a mere pittance in comparison with their needs, gives them a few men, not always those best suited to effectually advance the work, and expects them to go forward. There was a certain missionary jurisdiction vacant not long since. The former bishop had raised from $10,000 to $30,000 every year among his Eastern friends to carry on that work. He could do this because he made friends by his winning, charming personality, his eloquence, his ready wit, the stories he had to tell, the experiences he had undergone. The money was well spent. It sustained hundreds of church works of different sorts, many of them just beginning. The man who was selected to take up that work would have to face the absolute necessity of continuing to get approximately that amount, or allowing the work already begun to stop. That is a fearful obligation to set before a new and untried man, and the alternative is crushing. If those Western bishops are not walking in apostolic footsteps, I know of no men who do so walk. It is the most exhausting, wearying, heart-breaking lot that can fall to any mortal man to be a Western missionary bishop, and most of them fight it out until they die. The people are helpful, grateful, appreciative. They do what they can. Let none blame them. The story of the struggle of the Church in the West is the story of a great tragedy on the part of clergy and people. But it is through successive tragedies that men do arrive and attain, after all. The hem of the garment of progress is dabbled with the blood of men who have made way for her by the giving up of the treasure of their hearts to facilitate her advance. In that deluge of men which has rolled ever westward over the prairies, crept up the long slopes of the Rocky Mountains, finally beating over them in mighty waves to fall in thunderous surges of inundation on the other side, those who have led the way on the crest of the waves have been beaten into human spray, and having so smoothed the path, are cast aside. The footprints of civilization are those made by the feet of the men who stand beautiful upon the wild prairies and high mountain tops of the West, and bring good tidings, that publish peace, that cry unto Zion, Thy God reigneth. It is happiness to me that during the youngest, freshest, strongest, and most enthusiastic portion of my life I was associated with them, bishops, priests, and people. There are men like Rowe of Alaska, Kendrick of Arizona, Whitaker of Nevada, Leonard of western Colorado, Tuttle of Salt Lake, Hare of Dakota, Brewer of Montana, Graves of the Platte, Talbot of Wyoming, Spalding of Colorado, Worthington of Nebraska, Brooke of the Indian Territory, Whipple, Gilbert, Gillifam of Minnesota and Millspa, and the noble Thomas of Kansas, who have fought and struggled and passed through as great adventures as the paladins of old. I do not presume for a moment to place myself even in juxtaposition with such as they. They had, or have, stories to tell which would stir the blood if they could only be induced to proclaim them. These little sketches have only this value: they may perhaps fairly represent what the average missionary undergoes and must expect in that great empire of the West, in which some day will lie the balance of power of the great republic. I, though born in the East and living there now, say God speed the day. End of Chapter 11. End of Recollections of a Missionary in the Great West, by Cyrus Townsend Brady.